Okay, so let me start and let me control the time also. I think it's like 45 minutes or something. Okay. So this is my goal. So we've been talking about foundation models for a long time, and you see models that are trained with a lot of data. The goal of this talk is the story of a research line of, a line of research in my group on trying to train a foundation model with no data. And let me explain what I mean by that. So the years from 2000 to 2015 is what we call the golden era of benchmarks. Like everybody was producing big data sets, collecting lots of images, annotating ground truth data, and we knew exactly what we had to do. We knew how to evaluate models. We knew what the goals were, what the gold standard was. It was great. You could take a picture. Well, you had to know a lot of things. You had to be an expert in, graphical models, geometry, Gibbs sampling, decision trees. Like nowadays, it's all about neural networks, but at the time it was, there were a lot of things that you had to know. And once you knew all these things and you had all that data, you could train your best computer vision algorithm. You took a picture like this one, and this was the output. and you had to publish this, and that was it. But it was all great. Everybody was happy about this because it was very clear. This is not working, and we knew exactly where we were. I think that nowadays the picture is completely different, and we don't really know where we are. And what we discovered is that the benchmarks were great, but they were actually not that large. And then people realized that really, if you want to collect a big data set, you should start targeting like collecting an infinite amount of data, because then things start to work. And it's been like several years now of a really success story around this idea of collecting massive data sets that allow you to do like magical things. And of course, also huge neural networks. You need a place where to put all this data, and what best than a big neural network where it will kind of fit the whole thing inside, and then it can answer all kinds of questions that you care about. And these models are amazing. They can do really astonishing things. Like you cannot read it there, but I'll tell you what it says. So this is something that you can ask to ChatGPT, like to solve a high school math problem, like a treasure hunter found a chest full of gems, and there were like 175 diamonds and 35 fewer rubies than diamonds, and so on and so on. At the end, you ask how many gems there are on the chest, and ChatGPT will give you an answer with a perfect reasoning on, what is the unknown, what are the equations that you need to solve, and at the end, it will tell you there are 225 gems inside the chest, which is wrong, but who cares? It's beautifully written, they perfectly reasoned. It's just these systems are amazing, okay? So I'm sure that you've attended many conferences and many workshops, and there is always some senior faculty that will tell you, well, all this is good and great, but the really interesting limit is when n goes to 1. Like training with an infinite amount of data, that's unnatural, that's not how humans learn. Ideally, you want to learn with just one single data point. That's the target. So what we wanted was to take this to extreme. I want to do that, but let's do n equals 0. Like I really want to train this model with no data whatsoever, not even a single training examples. Okay, so this is kind of crazy, so let's see what I really mean. And this is a collaboration with multiple people. Philippe, Isola, and Manel and Adrian have been kind of driving the research behind this project. So let me tell you what the story is. What do I mean by n equals 0? So when you're training a vision system, you need two types of things. You need images, and you need some sort of ground truth data that gets associated to that. It could be labels, segmentations, whatever you want. And the community has been really good at getting rid of labels. Now we have some really spectacular unsupervised learning approaches that are able to learn just from images what a good visual representation is that will allow you to solve all kinds of really interesting questions. So, for instance, contrastive learning is an example of a great technique that is able to get rid of the need of labels, and you learn really good visual representations. Like, the typical approach in contrastive learning is you have a bunch of images, and then you have a set of augmentations that will be like translations and scalings and color jittering and so on, and then you train a contrastive loss that will classify, it tries to get one image nearby all its possible transformations, all its augmentations, and far away from all other images, and then you minimize that loss, and amazingly, you get a representation that is really good. So, that's not what I mean by n equals 0. I really want to get rid of the images too. Like, I want to get rid of the whole thing because the labels were hard to get, but the images are also hard to get. I just don't want to have anything. Okay, so now, things get crazy. This is where is the point where it gets really difficult to convince any student to work on this project. People worry about their careers, and I think for a good reason. But there is always a first-year grad student that doesn't really know very well what the field is about, and you can convince them to work on this. Anyway, and then they realize and they move out of the project. But anyway, so we have managed to make some progress, and what I want to tell you is a little bit the story behind this project and how we have been climbing the performance here. So okay, you have to learn with something. So what it is going to be? Well, this is the game that we are trying to play. You have some neural network that is going to take us input a picture, and you want to learn some visual representation that should be able you should be able to use that linear representation to solve a number of problems. For instance, classification or computing visual similarities or whatever. And the game really is, what are these weights? What are the weights that you should put in the neural network? And that's the game that we will try to play. So, just as a benchmark, just to measure some performance, and I'll show results in a different set of benchmarks, but I'm going to start with just a small version of ImageNet because it makes all the experiments to go faster. This is ImageNet 100, which is just a subset of ImageNet, and it's a 100 classification task, very simple, and the goal is to do at that task as good as possible. So what I will do is I will have this table of performance where you have the vertical axis is performance and classification by just having a linear readout. So you have some visual representation that you learn somewhere, somehow, and then you're allowed to train a linear layer to perform the final classification. No? So that's the place where you can use ImageNet. So we'll do that. It's fair game. And what I'm showing there on the stream right there is the performances that you get when you apply contrastive learning, no labels, on several data sets. So one will be the ImageNet 100 itself, ImageNet 1K, or STL, which is a very small data set. And you can see where performances are more or less. It's around like 55% performance, and that's the best we can do when we train with these images in an unsupervised way. So this is contrastive learning on real images. Okay, but this is the game. We cannot use any images, we cannot use any labels, so what do we do here? Okay, so we are given this neural network, we need to put some weights there. We don't have data, so what do? Well, you can put just random weights. When you initialize the neural network, if you have no data, then you don't start epoch 1 and you're done. And what are the results if you do that? Well, if you do that, it's actually not so horrible. Like if you plot, you have the representation that is computed from a neural network that was initialized with random weights, and now you do a linear readout on it and train on ImageNet for that linear layer, then you get around 20%, slightly above 20%, which is way better than chance. And in fact, if you use some simple features like the mean colors or the row pixels, then you get performances that are lower. So this neural network with random weights is already not too bad. It tells you something about why is that we didn't discover these neural networks that they were working way before. Like we didn't even need to train them and they were already kind of working. Anyway, that's a different story, I guess. But can we do better than that? Well, I will say that there has to be something in the middle between these two extremes, between random weights and training with real images. There has to be something that we should be able to do between these two upper and lower bounds. So that's what the game is going to be. Let's try to put some things here in the middle. And you can see that I left a lot of room here, so there might be something that we did there. Okay, so just as another interesting test, one thing that is useful to do always is once you have a visual representation, just compute nearest neighbors. You take some images, you have your training, you have your test set, and compute nearest neighbors from some query images just to see what the visual representation is actually doing. The nice thing about this is that it doesn't require any training. There's no linear layer. It's just using the representation as is, which I think is the cleanest experiment. So you take these 5 images and you query on this ImageNet 100. It contains like around 100,000 images. It's a pretty large data set. And these are the nearest neighbors. Well, they are not great. They get some of the colors right, but that's about it. There is really no understanding of the picture. The neighbors are kind of all over the place. It's really just about the colors. So in fact, accuracy, if you try to do a k nearest neighbor classifier, the accuracy is around 4.4%. It's not very good. Still better than chance, but not very good. So what else can we do? Well, we have no images, we have no labels. What else can we do? Well, you could use synthetic images. You could take some virtual world that simulates images and use that. Why not? That would be, not using real images. And in fact, if you do that, you get performances that are not too bad. And here are just these 2 simple virtual worlds that are not very visual, not very photorealistic rendering, and still give you representations that are not too bad. The problem with this is, people have been working really hard on these virtual environments. They can get very realistic. It's very hard to program them. And there is always this problem of the gap between simulation and reality. You need to get a lot of things right. This is a simulator that we have that is called Virtual Home. And this is one of the renderings. So these are animations. And you need to get all the details right. Like there is this person that wants to watch TV. And now, the camera viewpoint is not great. So we pick another one, and now he wants to drink, and look, he doesn't know where the mouth is. You need to have all these details right, and there's always this gap between reality and simulations, and it's really hard to close it, and people work really hard on trying to make these models work. So I will argue that these models, this type of data is just as expensive to get as real images. So this is not what I want. I don't want to use this type of data. What else can we use? Well, there are other things that biology have been using. So what I will show you here is recordings of the retina of unborn mice, where they were recording the spontaneous activity that was happening in the retina before they ever opened their eyes. And what you see here is, you see some movies, and there are like small patterns that seem to be moving around, and it looks like noise, but it has a structure also. And what people believe is that this type of signals that are spontaneously generated on the retina, they actually serve the purpose of start pre-training the motion detectors in the brain later on. So you could imagine that maybe there is a way of generating data with synthetic worlds that don't pretend to look real, but they still capture some properties of the visual world. So instead of trying to close and make the gap between simulation and real very, very small, let's just make it huge, but make it huge in some direction that is actually interesting, and that's what we will try to do. So what we want to do is to train with images that are just very different from real images, but are still informative. And there is this very nice piece of work on pre-training with unnatural images that introduce this idea of just generating fractal images, and you can use these fractal images to pre-train a model, and you show that once you pre-train a model like that, if you fine-tune the model, it actually learns faster to reach some level of performance. But we don't want to use any fine-tuning. Like one of the things that was forbidden in this project is you cannot fine-tune anything. There is no real data. So we just want to see how far do you get just training with these unreal images with no fine-tuning. So in fact, if you use fractal images and no fine-tuning, then you get there around about 30%. It's not too bad. You get 2/3, on this gap between random and real. So it's pretty good. It's better than some of the like virtual worlds, but still far away from real data. So what else can we do? So at some point we started asking the question is, can we just look at noise? And which properties does this noise need to have so that if I just look at noise, I can learn something? And so what is that noise really means? So this is like white noise on, totally uncorrelated noise. This is maybe too unstructured, but there are other ways of generating noise that has some structure that is very easy to control, very low parametric models that will generate images that maybe you can actually learn from them. So now what we did is just to start creating different types of processes and see how far we could go. And the nice thing about this project is that you don't have to beat the performances of, you don't have to beat any performances. Like the only thing that you need to beat is whatever you did before, which is a great project because you cannot go wrong. Okay. There is no, you don't have to compare with anything. You just try to climb the ladder of performance. So what I will do now is I will explain a series of processes, each one giving better and better performances. And let's see how far can we go in this ladder of performance and how far we get, how close we get to real world images. And so the first process is a process that was introduced in the 60s. So this is kind of going to be a little bit of a history of computer vision. So this process is called deadlifts, and it was very popular in the 60s and the 70s, and it was very popular at the end of the 90s as a very good image generative process that reproduced some of the properties that were important in natural images. So this process consists on the following. It's called deadlifts because it simulates leaves falling out from a tree on the ground, overlapping with each other with different colors and different sizes. In this case, the leaves are just squares, and they are dropping on the image randomly, and they're occluding each other until they fill the whole image. It's a very simple process, and you can generate as many as you want. There is no limit. They are free to compute. In fact, if you're training with them, you can have a single different image for every single iteration. Like you don't need to see the same image twice ever if you want. So here there are some examples of images that correspond to that process. And then you can make the leaves more complicated. Like here now, the squares can have also arbitrary orientations, or they can have different shapes. Like here they have also triangular shapes, circles. You can have anything you want. So what happens if you train a representation just looking at those images using contrastive learning? So you still have your set of augmentations, the same augmentations that you use for ImageNet, but now just on those images instead. What happens if you train with these images? Well, let's look at the experiment with nearest neighbors. I've trained the model, I have now a visual representation, and I can use it on real images, even though that the model has never seen a real image. So if I have my 5 images that I used before, and I look at the top nearest neighbors, these are the ones that I get. I don't know if this is a step forward or backwards. Now the colors are not right. It lost the colors in many cases, but there are a few things that are quite interesting, like the birds. There are a few matches that are not too bad. The middle one is actually not too bad. There are a few things that start kind of looking fine. In fact, the accuracy went up to 12%, which is already 3 times higher than what we were getting with a random neural network. So it's not very good, but we still have 30 minutes to go into the talk, so hopefully something else happened, no? Okay, so how does it look in my plot? Now I will train a linear readout just on that representation, train on ImageNet, and let's see how far it can go. And here is what the models are. The 3 ones correspond to different models of the leaves. The first one with the lowest performance is just squares that are axis aligned. The middle one has random orientations, and the last one has arbitrary shapes. So it seems to follow a natural ordering. The more complex and diverse the leaves are, the better the performances are. And it's actually not too bad. It does better than fractals. This is a very simple process to write down. I mean, there's a few lines of code to write this process. And it gets close to Minecraft, which is a much more difficult process to write. This is very simple. And it's around midway between random and natural images for almost no effort whatsoever. There is a question here? Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, what is the intuition why this works? So part of the reason is because this type of images, even though they are still very different from natural images, they were actually built to represent some properties that were important in natural images, and I will describe some of them now. But they capture just very low-level properties about images that seem to be uniform, that exist within the space of images. But of course, there are many other properties that are important to real images that are not here. So this is why there is still a very important gap. But there are a few things. They have edges, they have some shapes. So there are regions that you need to differentiate. And when you run the set of augmentations, you will need to be able to find like the same square moved around. So there are a few things that you need to do. You have to think that this is in combination, these images come in combination with the augmentations. And it's these two things that is really important. Like if you only have the images and you don't have the augmentations, then it wouldn't be easy to do this. So let's continue climbing. Yes, there is another question. Oh, just the same contrastive loss objective. We haven't changed, so that I will not change. And this is just, I believe it's a ResNet 50. So ResNet 50 contrastive loss. We haven't changed a line of code there. Okay, another property of natural images. This is a remarkable property of natural images that, students in computer vision at the beginning of the century will usually learn, and now I don't know if you learn these things anymore. But if you take a picture and you do the Fourier transform, how many of you know what the Fourier transform is? Okay, okay, good. If you take the Fourier transform of a picture, it has this particular shape that the magnitude of the Fourier transform has most of the energy concentrated in low special frequencies, and then it drops with a profile of 1/f as you go to higher and higher frequencies. And I challenge you to find a picture, you are welcome to take a picture anywhere that doesn't have this property. And you will see how hard it is. You will find some, but it's going to be really, really hard. Most of the images that you will take will have this shape, 1/f. So if this property is so important in natural images, what if we create images that have that property? So in fact, that property has been used to explain many of the characteristics of the visual system. For instance, there is this famous paper from the 90s on trying to explain the structure of the retina in the human eye, why it performs a particular type of filtering, and this property of the 1/f structure of natural images is part of what explains most of the behavior, the functional behavior that we see on the retina. And as a cute experiment, probably, I don't know how many of you have seen this plot, but this is a very famous display that shows a sinusoidal, in the horizontal axis is just a sinusoidal that increases frequency, and the vertical axis, the only thing that is changing is the amplitude, is making the amplitude smaller and smaller, but it's a separable function. It's the product of these two things, a sinusoidal with increasing frequency and a ramp on the amplitude. And you can see that if you look at this, if you look at the profile of this shape where the contrast seems to disappear, you see a shape that looks like it's low here and then goes up and then low again, depends on where you are sitting in the room. And this is basically your eye is behaving as a bandpass filter. So it's removing some of the low frequencies, removing some of the high frequencies, and enhancing the middle ones. And the reason of this is because there is this 1/f property of natural images, and your initial, your behavior here is just the inverse of that 1/f, so that it kind of whitens the image as it goes into the optical nerve. That was kind of the story that people was explaining at the time. So this property seems to be important in natural images, and it's all over the place, and it seems to explain some of the behavior in your visual processing. This is the profile that you see normally. So how do you create images that have this property? Well, very simple. You start with noise. So this is going to be like a diffusion model, but with one single linear layer, okay? Just as talking your language. So here you start with noise. And then what you do is this white noise is going to have a flat power spectrum. Just multiply the power spectrum with something that has 1/f shape. And then you do the inverse. And you do this in each color channel independently, and you get a color image out. And they will look like this. They are pretty interesting. It just looks like clouds. Whenever you have a 1/f noise, it always looks like clouds. And here there are a bunch of them. And the only thing that I'm changing here also is the slope of the power spectrum. So depending on the slope, you will have much lower frequency content or more high frequency content. And that's why you see differences here on the clouds. And you can create as many images as you want like this. They are very, very easy to generate. And again, you can generate one per iteration. Like you don't need to see the same image twice. So what happens now? Okay, there is a question.
Same thing with PCA.
With PCA. Well, you can think of this as PCA. Like the Fourier transform is basically PCA on images. Like if you do the PCA, PCA of millions of images, you will get Fourier bases, more or less. Okay, so what happens now if you train with those? These are really noise image noise. It's called pink noise. So these are noisy images. What happens if you train using contrastive learning on those images? Well, you get there. Okay, so we did a step back. It's not too bad. Oops, it's not too bad, but it's still better than random. It's better than some of the very simple virtual worlds. It's not as good as fractals or the other models, but it's not too bad. And so, but that property is not enough by itself. So I'm not going to even compute the nearest neighbors or anything like that. We have other things to do. But there is another remarkable property of natural images. If you take a picture, any picture that is a real image, and you compute its histogram, so in this case, it's a grayscale image. If you compute the histogram, you get some random profile of different numbers of times that each pixel intensity appears on the picture. But if you take the same picture and you filter it with a 1-1 filter, or any zero mean filter that is compact, you will get a picture that will look like this. And if you do the histogram of this image, you get a profile like this. That's a very strange profile. It's very well organized. It's symmetrical around 0. It has a peak at 0 and then it drops with a very particular shape. And it looks like nothing like the original histogram. And the interesting thing is that any image that is real that you take, if you do this, you compute the histogram, you get the same histogram. So here there are just another image. You can see the histograms, they look identical, both vertical or horizontal dimensions. You can do this with many, many different kinds of filters that have to be zero mean and compact, and you get basically the same histogram shapes. So this is another property of natural images that also people have exploited in many different ways for image denoising, all kinds of algorithms that use this property of natural images as a way of characterizing what makes an image different from noise. Like if you take Gaussian noise, if you do this, the histogram will look Gaussian. It will not look like this. So this is very different from a Gaussian distribution. And people have used this property to explain why is that in cortex we have simple and complex cells and they have the particular shape, and they show that if you train a model to have that type of sparsity coding that it corresponds to these sparse outputs of filters, then you actually get Gabor filters. This was very important in the 90s again, showing it was the first time that someone had an algorithm that in an unsupervised way could discover units, convolutional kernels that look like the ones that you actually find in some of the neurons in the visual cortex. And then it also inspired another really cool line of work, which was in texture synthesis. Higer and Bergen showed how to use this property of the sparsity of the response of natural images to simple kernels to create a image generative process that will generate images that will look pretty interesting. And again, this was before diffusion models started. And this, you can think of this as a diffusion model with 2 layers. And it was actually quite cool. So this is some figures from the paper. You have real textures, you perform some analysis, that gives you a representation for these textures, and then now you can sample from them and generate more textures, more images that have the properties of the training of these reference images. And you see these sample textures on the right. They look a little bit like the reference images. It's not great. Like nowadays, with any neural network, that even if it has bugs, you can do better than this already. But at the time, this was quite impressive because the only generative process at the time that was working was always generating clouds. This was the first time that something was not generating clouds. It was pretty spectacular. And it was based just in these computing histograms on the outputs of convolutional filters on images. So we can do the same thing. How do we use this property to generate images that have this property that we know is so important in natural images? Well, again, you start with noise. This is your diffusion model. And then the first thing that you do is you impose the 1/f spectrum. Then you compute something called the steerable pyramid. You impose that the filter should have sparse responses. Then you decode it into a picture. We impose also that the colors should have kind of the shape of the leaves. This is to add another constraint. And at the end, you end up with images that look like this. So these images have the 1/f power spectrum. They have sparse filter responses. And they have color distributions that look like there are only a few things in the image. They look interesting. Totally unreal. Like if I show you a picture like this one, I will have a hard time convincing you that this is a real image. but still they have some interesting properties, no? They look pleasing to the eye. You can generate as many as you want with different properties of the slope, the sparsity coefficients, and so on, and you generate a family of them. And now you can train with those images and create a visual representation and compute nearest neighbors, and let's see what happens. So here are the 5 input images that I was showing before, and I just compute this visual representation for all the images in my data set, retrieve the nearest neighbors, and this is what I get. And this is now quite spectacular. The performance now went to 28%. This is pretty high already. The images, the neighbors are actually quite spectacular. Like the parrots is classifying, is retrieving other parrots as images. This system has never seen a parrot in its life. Okay, the closest thing to a parrot that it's seen is just a splash of colors on a canvas. That's all it's seen. And it can retrieve the lobsters over there, the birds. It's pretty amazing, no? There is a rabbit in the middle between the birds. Who knows what it's seeing there? But these neighbors are pretty good. And this is with ever seeing a real image. So now it has the power of getting a pretty good visual representation. So what happens now if I do the linear readout? So here is the plot of performances. We train a linear classifier on this representation. What do we get? You can see there are a lot of holes still to fill here. So where will it land? There. Okay, so this one, there are a few models depending on which of the coefficients, what different parts of the model are we actually using, but the one that uses everything is the one that works the best, and it's just shy of the performances that you get with Minecraft. With a simple, very, very, very simple process. Again, this is a slightly longer code than the deadlift model, but still pretty short. This is not a lot of lines of code. So this is pretty nice. You get pretty high performances. Now we are, two-thirds of them, a little bit less than two-thirds of all the way to real images. So what else can we do? Well, you can actually combine dead leaves with these textures. So you can take the dead leaves model and just crop images, crop pieces from this new process and use that as the texture that goes inside the leaves. And if you do that, you get a slightly better performances, now really close to Minecraft, but that process is a little bit more complicated. But anyway, so what else can we do? Well, in the meantime, there are a lot of advances, and one example of another model that seems to capture something very interesting about natural images are generative GANs. These neural networks, like a style GAN, they are able to learn to render images that look very, very real. So there must be something inside them that already contains a good structural prior of how images are created. So if you train with real images, you get real, pretty nice images. Of course, we cannot do this. We cannot take a GAN and just sample from it and then train with that, because that's using real images, and the game here is not to use any real images. So you cannot use a GAN that is being trained. But you can use a GAN. So we will use a GAN, but you cannot train it, okay? So what do you do here? Well, one thing that you could do is just put random weights on the GAN and then hope that the structural prior is good, strong enough, and that you can sample from it and it creates images that are useful. If you do that, what do you get? Well, who knows? There is something else that you could do. You could actually put into the kernels, you could say, well, I'm not going to put just random weights. I'm going to put things that look like this, that I kind of recognize. Some of the kernels look like derivatives or blur kernels or Laplacian kernels. So you can put a bunch of kernels there. And Jonas, at the time, a postdoc in my group, spent a lot of time in finding, what is the configuration of weights that I need to put inside the GAN so that when I sample from it, it gets you some images that look interesting. So these are the images that you get when you sample from the GAN, initialized by hand, put in these kernels that are just like Gabor derivatives and so on. So familiar kernels. So this looks very much like the one I was showing before. But there are a few more properties here. Like if you look at some of the images, they seem to have some 3D-ness to them. So these are textures that have some 3D shapes. It's very shallow, but there seems to be something richer about these images than the ones that we were showing before. So now you take these images, you train with contrastive learning your representation, and what did you get? These are the 5 target images that I was showing before. You retrieve nearest neighbors, and this is what you get. And I have to say, this seems to be worse than before. But that's just because we didn't really curate these images. This is what it is. And sometimes performances go down visually or up, but actually the number is higher. This is 33% right. It just happens that for these 5 images, it just looks worse. But overall, the performance is actually slightly better than the one that we were getting before, that was 28%. Okay, so what else can we do? Well, now you can train the linear readout and check how far, what the performances are. And here it is. We are there. This is the best model, the model that had these handcrafted kernels. It gets, now is slightly above 2/3, closing the gap to real data. But you can see that I still leave some room there. So what else can we do? So why is that these models work? Well, actually, these images, these images here, they still look very far from what real images are. But at the local patch level, they start looking very realistic. Like in fact, here I'm showing 6 crops from real images and synthetic images from our process. And it's, with some, if you look at them a little bit, eventually you will be able to tell which ones seem to be fake or real, but it's kind of hard. So at the local patch level, these images, these synthetic images are generating images that are pretty good in representing the structure of the real world. And this is the actual split of which ones are real and which ones are fake. So some of them are hard to tell. So this is why these processes start creating representations that are pretty useful. So in fact, there is a parallel line of work in the language domain that also have shown that if you can train models with random text, with different structures where you have generative models of text that may have like simple grammar rules, and if you pre-train a model with this, it actually has already a pretty good head start when you train a language model. So this, it seems to happen also within languages, not just about images. So what else could we do? So there is a big community of people creating this very cool graphic representation, this code that renders these very beautiful graphics that are called shaders. The shader is just, here is this fragment, which is just a very small piece of code that if you run this on in the appropriate interpreter, of course, you get this beautiful sequence. And so you can think of this as a very simple process that generates images that kind of look like some of the deadlifts models that we were using. But one of the advantages here is that, this is very simple, and there are lots and lots of programs like that. So we can actually collect a very large database of processes that all of them render images that are relatively simple, but they are very diverse. So we collected a bunch of them. So here there are some examples of images that get rendered with some of these processes, and you get a sense of the diversity. So we created a data set with 21,000 different types of shaders that render all kinds of very different images, but they are all these kind of very strange processes. They all look like different types of generative models that are like the ones that I was presenting before. So now you can sample from these processes and generate a big data set and train with it. Because there are 21,000 of them, you can actually even use the labels, which process they come from, to use like a supervised contrastive learning approach to even improve further the performances. So when you do that, if you do the nearest neighbor task, you take these 5 images, you compute the nearest neighbors, and you get neighbors that are really astonishing. Like these ones are really good. There are still a few mistakes, but you can see the people here eating lobster. There are 2 neighbors that contain a person with a lobster. Like this model has ever seen a person or a lobster or anything that is real, and it's it has a pretty good notion of visual similarity. So this is pretty amazing. So what happens here in the performance game? Once you use that representation and you train a linear readout, what do you get? You get this performance here, which is now really close to real world, to training with real images. That gap is really small at that point. So of course now, one question is, well, this is ImageNet 100K, 100, what happens with the original ImageNet? So we did those experiments too. So we took ImageNet 1000, a ResNet 50, and we trained a bunch of models because we have the computational resources that we have. So we didn't compare the whole thing, but we compared a few of them. And this is what we got. So, just using shaders, it gets pretty close to the performance that you get on ImageNet if you pre-train with places. Places is another data set with real images. If you train with ImageNet, then you of course overfit a lot to ImageNet. And our goal is not, we cannot compete with that, but we can compete with training with another set of real images that doesn't look like ImageNet. So, we choose places for that because there is very little overlap between the two data sets. And you can see that, the performances are pretty good, getting close to what you get with real images. But still, the gap has increased. It's not as small as it was before. So what else can we do? Well, so the latest work was, in trying to close that gap, what we did was to do the following. And this is work led by Adrian in my group. You take the shaders, these synthetic images, generated images, and you sample 3 at random, and you do the following thing. You take the first one, and you use the first one to create a mask. So just binarizing it by using like a k-means segmentation approach and just segment it into 2 sets. And then once you have this mask, you use this mask to mix the process 2 and 3 by taking, the white pixels from S2 and the black pixels from S3 and create a new image that has this mixture between 2 of them. So it's just, it has a combination. And the nice thing about that is that it creates now the shapes that are intermixed, controlled by another process that defines the boundaries in an independent way. So it's a little bit like some strange deadlifts model, So what happens if you train with this? Well, so here there are some examples of the original shaders, and here is the shaders with these mixtures. Now the images look a little bit more complicated and interesting, but somewhat similar. And you can generate a gazillion of them again. There's no limit. You can generate as many as you have memory for. And then now, what happens if you use that model and you train, a linear readout on ImageNet 1000? So this is the performance that we had before, and this is what happens when you use this process. It closes the gap further. This is the best we have right now. And the goal is to continue climbing the ladder to close the gap with real images. But that gap is getting really, really small. And depending on the field where you're working, like if you're applying this to medical images, that domain, that gap is really tiny. It's very, very small because ImageNet to real images is already far away and our processes are not any farther. So it gets actually pretty close to the performance that you get to in medical images if you pre-train with ImageNet. So now if you play the nearest neighbors game, these are the 5 images, and these are the retrieve neighbors. These are really good. These neighbors are really amazing. Like even the one that is very difficult, the people eating lobster, you see a bunch of people eating things, not necessarily lobster, but it's very, very close. And you can actually look not just at those, it's 20 nearest neighbors, and they all look very regular. The parrots, you get many, many parrots. The birds, there are a few foxes and other animals in the mix, but it gets mainly birds. It's just pretty good. The neighbors are pretty good. And this system has never seen a real image, which is, pretty surprising. You can do many other things. So now, once you have this model that is pre-trained that works so well, you can think of this as some kind of foundation model that can solve many, many different tasks, but it's never seen real images. And the fact that it hasn't never seen real images has a number of interesting applications. So here is another challenge that is to try to reproduce human-based visual similarities. So in this data set, there is a reference image, and there are 2 different images, and people have to choose which one is the closest to the reference. So there is, this is being collected in Philippe's lab. And what you have is just the preferences, what the votes from humans of which image they prefer, A or B, as being the closest to the reference. And the goal is to match that. So when you use the models trained with these processes with no fine-tuning, nothing, just the representation as is given, and you use that to compute similarities, you actually get very close similarities to the ones that you get with ImageNet. With the difference that, again, this has never seen a real image. So you're already getting a pretty good foundation without having opened your eyes. Now, this is all before the animal, in this case, the system is actually born into the world. You can actually use it for segmentation because, if you use, depending on the system that you use, here we are using a VIT pre-trained with Dino. So you can do this in many different types of settings. So here is an image. This is the ground truth segmentation. And this is what you get with ImageNet if you do PCA on the features computed from the VIT. So you get a pretty nice segmentation that seems to correlate with the segmentation, the ground truth segmentation. If you take a neural network that has just random weights, this is what you get. So you do PCA on the representation, you don't really get anything meaningful. It seems to be mostly like kind of detecting edges or something like that. But if you do it with the model trained with our processes, then you get something like this, which is already a pretty good segmentation of the image. It's not as good as what you get with ImageNet, but it's pretty close. So now what you can do is you have this procedurally trained neural network that will take as input an image, and then you can have another module that comes later on that maybe you can train that one with real images, but now you can put very strong constraints because it's already using features that are very strong. For instance, you might want to have a model that has to be efficient to train, or maybe you want it to be editable, or maybe you want to be able to compute attributions from it on real images because you don't care about the processes. You don't care about attribution on the processes, but you care about attribution on real images. So, but now you only need to care about how you are going to attribute the change in behavior of the system based on the final layer that you're doing something with it. So you might actually be able to do that in a closed form, which you cannot do if you have a big neural network. And now you can, for instance, you could do in context learning where you train just that layer with a single example saying, well, I want to take an image and I want to output a segmentation mask. So you just give one example, and that single layer there could be something like a nearest neighbor based classifier. And if you do that, then you get an output that looks like this for that input image. So it's kind of capable of segmenting the input image. So this representation is not just good as a global representation, but even the local representations seem to be good. So this is the overall picture. Now you can have a model that will have like this foundation pre-trained model that is not based on any real data. It's all based on procedurally generated data. The game is what is the best process that you can put there to get the best performance possible. And then at the end, you will have a final module that maybe that's allowed to see real images to give you, to solve the final task that you care about. So maybe with this, what we'll see is eventually, we have this explosion on the size of training sets that we are using to train our models, but maybe at some point we'll see a decrease and we'll go to n equals 0. So this is kind of the approach that we are taking. This is the goal in the group, is trying to build these models that just learn to see by looking at noise, where noise really means some random process that is not grounded on reality, besides the fact that you actually have like expert knowledge about which properties are important to have in images, but it's never really seen an image process. So the bottleneck that goes from the real world into these processes is very narrow. And if you train with this process, you can actually get very good performance. So the game is, what is the best process out there that we can use to train these models? And with that, I will end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the inspiring talk. If there are questions, we have time for that. Yes, you can raise or go to the mic.
I wonder, is it fair to say that the contribution of work is that to show that it is possible to arrive at the same performance as Google is data for recognition has when you do successfully? Is it fair to say that?
Well, I mean, it will be like a big compliment that maybe is unfair because it's probably not completely true. Like I think that if you train with real data, you still do better. So we haven't really managed to completely close that gap. But the gap is getting smaller and smaller. Yes.
So I wonder if the same analogy would still exist when you're handling very high level tasks.
Yeah.
So for instance, like if I'm trying to, if I see like the machine and I try to understand what the machine might work, like how it would work or how it would function, would this kind of approach still work?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I am not sure what the answer is. So, I mean, the question is that many of these operations are really very low level, and what happens if you have a like higher level task? Will this type of approach still work? My guess is that it's going to work better than you think, but not as good as you would like. And better than you think because in even higher level tasks, there is always a lot of low level stuff inside that makes, is what makes most of the tasks hard. And then there is a piece of it that is really high level, and that piece you will not have it. You will need to learn it. But my guess is that you will need some real data at some point to close that gap. But a lot of the things that make some of the tasks hard, even the tasks that look very high level, they still have a lot of low level stuff inside them. And I think that's the piece that we can close.
The very low level class data set is actually decreased, but what complex data sets actually still decreased?
Yeah, my guess, yeah, that's a very good point. My guess is that, the high level, the data sets that you need to learn the high level stuff will have to be there, but probably they don't need to be as large, because a lot of the things that you learn from the gazillions tons of data that we use generally is a lot of low level stuff. But who knows? So there are a bunch of questions. I'll take them in order of depth. So maybe I'll go here.
Next one. So you mentioned like one of the main advantages of having data as you can have gazillion of them. I wonder if you noticed any advantage of this during training. Like, do you still see improvement as long as or does it like saturate very quickly?
Yeah, that's a great question. So so we have seen some of the scaling properties of real images. Like if your model is bigger, if you use more data, performances get better. Just the slope, and you start from a lower point, but we see the same scaling properties. Like larger models get more out of it. Like if you have a VIT with a lot more parameters, it performs better than a one that is smaller, even though you are training with the same data that it doesn't really have that much information inside, but it's still getting better. So if you add more and more epochs, eventually it saturates. But if you add more data, then it gets better. So depending on how you sample, but if you sample new data, if you're sampling new data every time, then it really depends on how you sample the data, because with this process, with the shaders, it's a little bit difficult to sample because many of these movies are periodic, and depending on how you sample, you start repeating data. So at some point there is like a plateau effect. So there was a question at the end. Yeah. Yes.
There one paper that basically like big words language model, and the utility of this was it trains fast and once you start training it. Did you experiment with taking these models that you trained on the state data and then training them on real data and then seeing how those curves compare to training from scratch?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, if you want to build a real practical application, that's the type of experiments that you have to do. And the reason why we didn't do those experiments is because it's my fault. That's because I forbid the students to use any real data. So the problem, once you enter into the fine-tuning game, that's all you care about, because that's where you start getting the high performances. But the problem is that then I don't know what is really going on. But then you lose a lot of time getting the fine-tuning work and so on. And I thought that if we had time, then we should invest it into discovering new processes more than discovering new ways of fine-tuning. But I think that if you want to build something, then fine-tuning is exactly what you should be doing. Yeah. Yeah, there is time for questions.
Minutes. Yeah.
Okay.
So
2 or 3.
Talk, we saw that you're progressively getting closer and closer to a more crystallized sense of structure, right? You start with dead leaves, there's like minimal structure, then eventually end up with texture. What is the next frontier that you might be looking at?
Oh, great question. Well, Rachel then will know. She's thinking about these problems too. But well, we are thinking about it. I don't know. But I think there is still a lot to be done. Yes. Yeah. Or over there. I think he was raising his hand for a while. Just you. And then I'll go here.
General,
Oh.
is it like specific to the retraining paradigm, or does it also generalize across like a reconstruction objective, for example?
So we have tried with different unsupervised losses, and it generalizes across them. Diffusion, Dino, all of these things seem to be working. We haven't, like mask out encoders, we haven't tried like a whole space of unsupervised losses, but everything that we have tried, these models, these systems, these processes seem to work, and with the same type of ordering that we find here. So there is a question at the end. Yes, you, and then I'll go.
So beyond analytics to videos, like for example, creating pointless animations and see if it actually makes.
Yeah, that's a great point. We haven't done that, but yes, I think that will be very interesting to do. And there are a few works that have extended these ideas to video. Yeah.
Do you think print pattern handles distribution better? Have you tried going it on?
Distribution shift. Yeah, that's a great question. We haven't really explored that super exhaustively. My guess is that the distribution shift here is so big that yes, it's probably going to handle it very well because it cannot be any bigger. So yeah, but we haven't explored that systematically. Okay.
All right.
I gotta make sure that
I see a lot of hands raised still, but you can try to catch him in the corridor. Let's give